In this module, we'll be looking at the cognitive component of early childhood. We'll look at how children's thought process is developed, and we'll assess in some ways the theory that has brought forth some light on the way children think, which is by Jean Piaget. As you may remember, Piaget states that the cognitive development does not occur only because of our aging process. It occurs because of experience and combination with our aging process. And between the ages of 2 to 7, children operate at the pre-operational stage. And this is typically the stage in which children learn language and are exposed to a lot of different things that they've now mastered, and their limited comprehension of a lot of words makes them make use of their brain in ways that was not seen before. For example, a child can get an eraser from a board and use it as a car, and then pretend that it is a helicopter. And the symbolism behind it allows us to see that there is some memory components, as they've memorized what a helicopter does, so they may make it hover over, and they may also make sounds with their mouth that resemble the helicopter. Again, letting us know that the child has memorized, has made some synaptic connections that allow him or her to make use of something that is not necessarily a helicopter. Make-believe play is where children learn to play teacher, for example, and they would pretend to be a teacher, and then they take turns and they would become students, or they may pretend to be parents, or they may pretend to be waiters or waitresses, and this again strengthens the information that they've acquired through their exposure. So a child who has had the opportunity to be at a restaurant and seen how waiters and waitresses behave would likely imitate some of that, because that is what their scheme tells them. And those schemes, again, are only made available through exposure and through the experience that Piaget speaks of. In this slide, you can see the definition of make-believe and what it really means in terms of what is going on in the child's brain. And again, we were talking about the maturity and the development of the cognition of the child. And when we engage in sociodramatic play, which is make-believe play with peers, we begin to see that there's a rapid increase from 2 years until early childhood. And so we're talking about 3 to 6 years of age. And this is where children tend to be more socially involved. As we looked in chapter 6, the interaction and attachment to peers becomes more important because of the child's ability to move, and because of the child's autonomy, and hopefully because the parents encouraged him to be autonomous and to take initiative. So as we look at this in here, we find that children can learn social skills and to learn to be more cooperative. They also can strengthen a lot of their mental abilities to pay attention, to imagine, to be creative, to regulate their emotions when they maybe don't get their way. And we also find that if children were to sometimes not have access to other peers, they can also make use of imaginary companions. And this imagination is basically this fantasized friend that could possibly be endowed human-like qualities. And we see this a lot in cartoons, where Disney may make a broom have a face, ears, and a personality. They also have trees that have mouth, and that the sun has a face and sunglasses, which is quite ironic. The sun has sunglasses. But they make all these different imaginary companions, and children really find this attractive, as they are exposed to humans and they are able to relate to that better. And this is a lot more common for 25 to 45% of preschoolers, of young school-aged children, and contrary to what others believed earlier, that this was some sort of mental distortion. If a child spoke to the doll or spoke to a broom, this is actually a positive thing, as they are strengthening their schemas about what they've been exposed to. As impressive as the thought process is for children at this age, we find that thinking is still quite limited. It is very rigid, it's not flexible in different things. They only allow instruction from that or he who they may respect or hold at a particular status, and they can only process one situation at a time. And this sometimes leads to children telling you that they do not love you because you didn't let them eat pizza, and then 10 minutes later, hugging you and thanking you and forgetting everything that they just did 10 minutes ago, the tantrum. And that is part of their lack of critical skills, critical thinking skills. They're only living in the moment. Not to mention that they're egocentric during this time as well. And this is their inability to distinguish how others' viewpoints may not be their own. Oftentimes, you'll hear of a child who may be at his house and mom may be at work in the office. And if they're speaking over the telephone, the child may say, "Mom, look at that corner." And the child somehow expects mom to have the exact same view as him. And this, again, is another example of egocentrism. They're also not able to master conservation at this point. And this is something that I'll demonstrate in the next slide. The most common example of conservation or mastery of a conservation task is the water. As you can see in here, the original presentation, this particular question, is there the same amount of water in each glass? And we, for the most part, would be able to see that, yes, there is the same amount of water. When we pour it into a larger bowl, as we see over here, we know that we're pouring the exact same amount of water that we had in this glass, but now it's going to be in a shorter but wider bowl. And we, as adults, hopefully recognize and realize that it's the exact same amount of water. A child who has not mastered the principles of conservation would be more likely to believe that there is more water in the taller glass than in the wider vase. And here are just a few other examples of conservation tasks with numbers, with mass, and with weight. Piaget has had a lot to say about the way we learn, and he has been considered for different curriculum development components. And in the education principles, we hear that Piaget tells us that there needs to be a learning that involves or consists of the child discovering on his or her own. And this would consist of the teachers being facilitators more so than just lecturers. And by facilitating, we find that children would perhaps make use of different props, such as building blocks, wigs, clothing items, puzzles, and through a variety of activities, the child would be encouraged to explore and discover on their own. This is the equivalent of maybe making you write a paper. This is the equivalent of making you engage in weekly discussions. For children, it would be a lot more enticing to have a lot of other colorful items that they can manipulate and make part of their lesson. We also hear Piaget telling us about sensitivity to children's readiness to learn. The idea that children learn the exact same way is an erroneous belief that has led to failure in the classroom and in our schools. We understand now that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and the idea that teachers should be in a significant way responsible for a child's success comes from the idea that not all children may be ready to learn because of different things. It could be different stress levels, it could be different learning styles, it could be different personalities. So it is encouraged, according to Piaget, that teachers introduce activities that would build on the current thinking of the child. So doing an assessment and having smaller class sizes would allow us to be able to assess, to tap into each child's potential and readiness and level so that we could help them master those principles that they are being taught. And on that same note, the last point of the acceptance of the individual differences, we find, again, that there should be an approach to teaching each child, not the class as a whole. When we teach the class as a whole, we may be leaving out a significant amount of children who may not be ready to learn. Socializing is made more important as we look at the process of learning and being able to complete tasks. When we look at Vygotsky, he argues that our sociocultural background and exposure is essential for us to find our personality and our identity. And we find that this may have something to do with the conversation and the feedback we get from people. We are, in fact, social beings, and we require to have some type of stimulation, that be that verbal or just being there. We see that in the movie Castaway, if you've watched it, there is a part where Tom Hanks is in an island by himself, and the loneliness is so intense that he makes a friend out of volleyball. And just spoiler alert, he names it Wilson. And he becomes really attached to Wilson, and he has conversations with Wilson. And we find that this is essential for sanity, as well as also being able to do things, support, build a hut, and plan the escape from the island. Well, children are the same way. And as adults, we may even engage in some of these things in there. In fact, speaking to ourselves is not a sign of insanity. It's a sign of development that is sometimes overcome as we mature cognitively and master the skills. Private speech, which is the first one we'll look at here, is when children start to communicate with themselves in the same way that they converse with others. And this is believed to enhance their thinking complexity. It is supposed to enhance their ability to control their own behavior, and we find that this is typically used for self-guidance whenever they need some guidance as to how to maybe solve a puzzle, or how to solve a math problem, or how to read certain things. They engage in private speech, and this, again, foundation for all higher cognitive processes. There have been studies where they've actually looked at children performance in mathematics, and they've looked at children who actually count with their fingers and those who do not. And what they find is that children who count with their fingers, contrary to what was believed before, are actually better at solving math problems, and they eventually outnumber that ability to count with their fingers, or that need to count with their fingers. But it is not a bad thing. It actually is strengthening and building those schemas that they have. Inner speech is an interverbal dialogue that typically is carried out while we are thinking or completing a task, but this is something that is seen later in life. As we master a task, we may no longer need to engage in private speech, so we engage in inner speech. For example, the first time you're cooking something with a recipe in hand, you may need to say out loud, 2 eggs, half a cup of milk, and all those different things. Once you master that task, you would not have to engage in private speech, but there would be an inner speech that would still facilitate the memorization and following each step. Along the same lines of interacting with others, we find Vygotsky speaks of interaction with others as a gradual process, and typically by the age of 3 and 5, we see that children engage in something that's called inner subjectivity, and that is a process by which 2 children who may have started a task with different understanding may arrive at a shared understanding. That is to say that if they're asked to engage in building a puzzle together, they may have started with different pieces, but they know that they have to agree on certain things. And so you start seeing the children collaborate and start building social skills. For example, the script right here that says, "I think it's this way. What do you think, Jimmy?" This basically demonstrates that the child is engaging and growing in a social and cultural way. Scaffolding also consists of adjusting the support that is offered during the teaching session so that the child's level of performance can be adequate for this in here. This is typically facilitated by an adult or by a teacher or by a tutor. By scaffolding, you basically break a big task into manageable units, giving guidance and support to the child so that they can engage in the polishing and processing of the task, but also building some social skills. We find sometimes that students at the college level are afraid to approach the professor. They're afraid to ask questions because maybe they were not facilitated with those processes earlier. So scaffolding cognitively is also one way to encourage the child to seek help from their peers or their professors. Intelligence tests are assessed regularly on children where they may suspect that there is a cognitive disability, and sometimes there are people who say that their intelligence that's displayed by a child at the age of 3 is equivalent to the intelligence they'll have when they're adults. And we find that that's not necessarily the case. And the reason why is because a child at the age of 3 or 4 may have a shorter attention span, and it would not be a lack of intelligence or low intelligence, but it could be distraction and other things that have to do with their underdeveloped brain. Intelligence tests seem to be better predictors at the ages of 6 and 7, and that is according to the traditional IQ test. We find that by 6 or 7, their academic achievements seems to reflect in some way the performance they'll have as adolescents and as adults. We also find that there are cultural and other factors on the IQ score of the child. For example, we know that children of lower socioeconomic status, they don't respond well to questions that may be presented by someone who they've not been exposed to. So an unfamiliar adult, an unfamiliar test proctor would be detrimental for children in lower socioeconomic status. And this may have something to do with maybe the lack of scaffolding practice earlier if they were not exposed to different people. They sometimes also react with higher levels of anxiety in classroom or when stimulated or told that it's an exam. And sometimes they seek the attention and approval for an adult rather than focusing on the task. And this would be an individual who's seeking validation with the person rather than with their performance. The home environment is also essential for mental development and intelligence. We find that when parents are warm and affectionate, then children often develop adequately and they have the cognitive and social and physical skills. You may remember we talked about psychosocial dwarfism. When a child is neglected or deprived of attention, they often can be shorter than their age mates, and this can be a reason for them to get bullied. It could be a reason for them to feel inadequate, and then their social skills would be affected. Language and academic knowledge are also stimulated through, we find educational toys and books. When they're available, the child would develop correctly, and they would feel confident. They would feel industrious when they get into school. Take them out to the park, take them out to the laundry, take them out to the market, and have them exposed to various things, and that would also allow for synaptic connections to be made. It is always nice to have a conversation with someone and say, have you ever been there? And they are able to say yes, and they contribute or add on to whatever you wanted to say. And that can only be made available through experiences. So parents who have reasonable demands for the mature behavior of a child are also beneficial for the child, and then those who may be too demanding or rigid in their discipline style. And also parents who resolve conflict with reason instead of physical force and punishment, that contributes significantly to an adequate development, mental development of the child. In our attempt to prepare children better and have them succeed academically as well as personally, we find that the preschool is an essential component, preschool years. And we find that there are different alternatives to preschool. Not everybody goes to preschool in the same way. The preschool is basically defined as a program with an educational plan attached to it. And they often learn basic things, colors, letters, numbers, reading, shapes, and sometimes the equivalent or the alternative to preschool for those who may not have educational experience could be just childcare. And this would occur throughout the exact same age. However, the difference with childcare is that it varies significantly In some cases, the children are dropped off at the adult's house. In some cases, the adult may come over to their house, and this can bring about a sense of instability. This could maybe keep a child from being exposed to different environments. And childcare, while it can have some form of educational experience, it's not necessary that it has it. The preschool requires that there be an educational experience attached to it, whereas childcare may just consist of feeding the child, changing diapers, and doing other things. At-risk preschoolers are considered to be children who may have been neglected, those who may already be in the system with social services because their parents were not providing an adequate environment for the child. And we find that Head Start programs are essential for them to be able to recover from this toxic environment that they were raised in. Head Start programs basically expose a child with 1 to 2 years of preschool, and they provide nutritional and health services. And that's why it's essential for these kids who may have been at an unfortunate environment. The key and success of this program with children who may not be at-risk preschoolers is that the parents be involved. And this is a central philosophy to the success of the Head Start programs. The involvement of parents in the school through activities, volunteering, serving on policy councils, and being involved in the program planning and possibly even decisions that consist of and curriculum and other components is essential for the child. The child solidifies their social circles by understanding that mom is present in school. They also are held accountable to know that mom is communicating directly with the teacher, and they know that the two major systems they're a part of, which is home and their school, are one that is designed to help them succeed. So Head Start programs, the first 5 in California, are essential and more so for children who may be at risk. Here you see some of the benefits of preschool intervention, and we could see that, interestingly, children who may be poverty-stricken and that attend these programs often have higher IQ scores and academic achievements. They're less likely to be to fail or flunk, retain in a grade, and there is also a greater number of them who graduate from high school in comparison to those who were poverty-stricken and did not get exposed to preschool programs. This is there's a study that was a longitudinal study, and it was reported in a study in 2005 in which they followed a group of individuals who were exposed to preschool programs earlier, and what they found is that even at the age of 40, those who had assisted or attended these preschool programs were more likely to succeed overall in life. In terms of their education, income, family life with more stability, and even more law-abiding behavior. So we find that these programs are an investment for our society with individuals who may be, unfortunately, in ways that may be more likely to lead them into crime and instability. Television is a very influential factor in children and in youth. And what we mean by television, we don't mean the actual device, because we know that in today's age, children access TV shows on YouTube or on their devices. So what we mean by television is just the programs that are seen there. And we find that Sesame Street is one of the most viewed programs, children's program in the world. This is important for us to study because it has been studied by curriculum developments and developmental psychologists to see what makes this program, this TV show, a good program for children. And what they've found is that the slow-paced format that in which they speak when they engage in storylines is easier for children to follow. We also find that they engage or expose children to mathematical skills and academic progress in elementary schools, which allows the child to grow, allows the child to grow from home despite maybe not having access to a preschool. So there is some benefit to having Sesame Street. accessible through our TV stations. But we wonder if a lot of parents are in fact aware of this in here. Sometimes we find that the least informed may be the parents, and as a result of that, they may maybe expose the child to other cartoons that may not necessarily be good for the cognitive development of the child. For example, Disney. A few years ago, Disney content was found to not be suitable for adequate development, cognitive development, that is. And the reason why is because their narrative tends to be longer and without many pauses. One of the best things that has been argued as a facilitator for cognitive development is what they call radio tunes, and it's basically a cartoon that is all audio. So the child would listen to an audio bite, and then they would have to imagine everything that is occurring. And it basically consists of maybe some music and some pause in between. So they'll say, Jimmy is heading to school on a sunny day. And there's some music playing in the background, and the child is asked to imagine what Jimmy is doing while he's walking. Then they'll give him another cue. Jimmy is now waiting at the bus stop. He is holding an apple in his right hand and wearing a blue cap. Pause, let some music play, and then let the child imagine what's going on. Jimmy now walks in the bus, and he sits next to Jaden. And as we go through the process of listening, the child has to imagine everything rather than be fed everything. We do find that children of lower socioeconomic status are more frequent TV viewers, and this sadly is sometimes the result of parents needing to get things done. So if you need to cook and you need to get things done, one of the ways to keep the child from interrupting your task may be to just have them be exposed to TV. And while this can be good if watching good content, it can also be bad when done heavily, as it detracts from academic and social success, and the child gets hooked on watching TV. When it comes down to computers, they're becoming more accessible and more affordable. And we find that about 70% of 4 to 6-year-olds have used a computer at some point. And when we're talking about computer, we are, in this point, referring to one with the mouse. But now with the iPads, we would probably increase this number to about 95%. And we would look at the age range and bringing it even lower, because now the iPads, you find children who are almost, it seems like they're born with a capacity to zoom in and swipe, and they recognize YouTube icons. And the benefits of this is here is that if they are exposed to good apps or good programs, they can develop their reading, language, drawing, mathematics in very interactive ways. They can also engage in hand-eye coordination improvement, as well as also paying attention and increasing that attention span when controlling these devices. But we also find that there's video games and there's various other risks with using this in here. So what's recommended by developmental psychologists is that they should limit the number of minutes depending on the age of the child. And in fact, last year there was a report in which they said that children under the age of 1.5 should not be exposed to any electronic devices at all. And in part is because of the blue light that's emitted from these devices, which makes the experience also impact our circadian rhythms. We find that insomnia, or the inability to sleep, or poor sleep quality is attributed to exposure to iPads or screen devices. The screen of the devices. They basically help us stay awake, but when we need to go to bed, they basically keep us awake inadequately, and we would wake up the next day tired, drowsy, and having slept poorly.